The ring was cold against Grace Doyle's palm, and the woman pressing it there had tears standing in her eyes like water refusing to fall. "He will not ask himself," Margaret Hawkins said, her voice low and certain, and carrying the full weight of a woman who had lived 62 years and learned exactly when to act. "So I am asking." Grace stared down at the ring. It was a simple band of hammered gold with a small turquoise stone set in the center, the kind of ring made by human hands rather than purchased from a catalog. The kind of ring that had been worn before, that carried the warmth of old skin in it even now. The kind of ring that meant something irreversible. "Mrs. Hawkins," Grace began, and her voice broke on the two words, which was already more honesty than she had intended to show. "Do not tell me you do not love him," the older woman said. "I have watched you love my son for 11 months. I have watched him love you for 11 months and do absolutely nothing about it because Walter Hawkins is the most stubborn, most frightened, most devastatingly proud man God ever set loose on this earth." She closed Grace's fingers around the ring with both her own hands. "His father was the same. I had to arrange my own courtship, Grace. I know what I am doing." Grace looked up at Margaret's face, and what she saw there was not manipulation but desperation, not a hidden motive but the raw, open love of a mother who could see her son drowning in silence and wanted to throw him a rope even if he was too proud to reach for it. "He will be furious," Grace whispered. "Absolutely," Margaret agreed. "And then he will ask you properly, and then you will say yes, and then we will all get on with our lives." She released Grace's hands. "Or you will say no, and I will have been a foolish old woman, and you will ride back to Abilene and take a position as a school teacher, and my son will spend the rest of his life staring at the door of this house waiting for you to come back through it." She paused. "I have seen that man stare at that door, Grace. I cannot watch it anymore." The wind came through the kitchen window and lifted the edge of the calico curtain, and the smell of sage and dry earth came with it. The smell of the Kansas plains in October of 1878, and Grace stood there with a dead woman's wedding ring in her closed fist, and felt the entire course of her life pivoting on this single breathless moment. She had not come to the Hawkins ranch expecting any of this. She had not come expecting Walter Hawkins at all. 11 months earlier, Grace Doyle had stepped off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad at the small station in Cimarron, Kansas with one trunk, $14.30, a letter of employment as a household assistant for the Hawkins family, and a heart so thoroughly broken by what she had left behind in St. Louis that she was quite certain she would never use it for anything romantic again. She was 24 years old. She had been engaged to a man named Clarence Webb who had proven, with spectacular thoroughness, that she had misjudged his character entirely. The betrayal had been so complete, so methodically executed, so devastating in its revelation that the man she had loved for 2 years had been simultaneously courting 3 other women and stealing money from his employer, that Grace had found herself sitting in the parlor of her aunt's house in St. Louis with no engagement, no savings of her own because she had lent Clarence everything she had, and no particular plan for her future. Her aunt, a practical woman named Ruth Doyle who had spent 40 years making do with what was in front of her, had placed the advertisement from the Hawkins family in Grace's hands without ceremony. "You need distance," Aunt Ruth had said. "Distance and wages and hard work. Those 3 things will fix what ails you more reliably than anything else I can offer." The advertisement had been simple. A widowed rancher with a 60-year-old mother and a working cattle operation outside Cimarron, Kansas required a household assistant. Room and board provided. References required. Preference given to women of solid constitution and practical temperament. Grace had written her letter of application with the careful precision of someone who understood that her survival depended on presenting herself as exactly what was needed. She was practical. She was constitutionally solid. She had references from her previous position, assisting the household of a St. Louis merchant family. She did not mention Clarence Webb. She did not mention the broken engagement. She did not mention that she was running toward the middle of nowhere because the middle of nowhere had no particular associations with humiliation and loss. The reply had come from Margaret Hawkins, not from the widowed rancher himself, and it had offered her the position in straightforward and warmly written terms, and Grace had taken it without ever having spoken to or seen Walter Hawkins in her life. The man who had met her at the Cimarron station on that November morning was tall and dark-haired and 30 years old, with a face that looked like it had been weathered by something other than just the Kansas wind. He had a jaw that could have been carved from the limestone bluffs along the Cimarron River, and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that the winter sky turned just before a serious storm. He wore a practical coat, good boots, and the expression of a man fulfilling an obligation. "Miss Doyle," he had said, and tipped his hat, and taken her trunk without being asked, and loaded it into the wagon with the efficiency of someone who had carried heavy things all his life. "Mr. Hawkins," she had replied, and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and they had ridden the 7 miles to the ranch in almost complete silence, which had suited Grace perfectly at the time, because she was exhausted from 2 days on the train and still raw in a way she had not yet learned to conceal. The ranch was modest and honestly kept. There was the main house, solidly built from limestone block in the way that many Kansas ranch houses were built in that era, low and practical against the wind. There were outbuildings, a proper barn, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that was sleeping for winter but clearly well-maintained. There were cattle in the far pasture and 2 horses in the near corral, and a dog of uncertain parentage who met the wagon with his tail going in circles. Margaret Hawkins had been standing on the porch, and she was exactly the kind of woman Grace had hoped she would be. Small and sharp-eyed and direct, with white hair pinned up in hands that showed 40 years of hard work and a smile that reached her eyes without any calculation in it. "Grace Doyle," she had said, coming down the porch steps with more energy than a woman her age should have possessed. "I am so glad you have come. We have needed someone with sense around here for some time. My son is competent, but he has a tragic inability to keep records, and the kitchen garden needs a person who understands what they are doing. And frankly, I am 61 years old and my knees have opinions about bending." She had taken Grace's hands in both of hers exactly the way she would take them 11 months later when she pressed the ring into them. "Come inside. I have made coffee and there is cornbread." Walter Hawkins had carried the trunk inside and then gone back out to the barn without a word, and Grace had sat at the kitchen table with Margaret and drunk very good coffee and eaten cornbread with butter and felt, for the first time in weeks, that she was somewhere she might be able to breathe. The first months were hard in the physical sense and easy in every other. There was so much work to do that Grace did not have time to think about Clarence Webb or St. Louis, or the life she had expected to be living. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with the same practical focus she had always applied to everything, and Margaret was an excellent teacher who respected the intelligence of the person she was teaching, which Grace had not always encountered. Walter she barely saw in those early weeks. He rose before dawn and worked until after dark and came in for meals with the focused quiet of a man whose mind was entirely elsewhere. He was not unfriendly. He was not cold. He was simply contained in a way that Grace recognized, in the way that one person who has been badly hurt recognizes the same condition in another person, like a bruise that has faded but still aches when the weather changes. Margaret had told her about it in March, when the first crocuses were coming up in the kitchen garden and Grace had been working the soil, and the older woman had brought her tea and sat on an overturned bucket to talk the way she sometimes did. "His wife died 3 years ago," Margaret had said, simply and without the particular theatrical weight that some people brought to such announcements, as if death was a performance rather than a fact. "Ruth Ann, influenza. They had been married 4 years. Walter was 27. He has not been himself since, though he would argue with you about that until Tuesday if you told him so." Grace had thought of Clarence Webb, which was not the same kind of loss at all but was still loss, and had understood something about the man she saw at mealtimes more clearly after that. "I am sorry," she had said. "He is sorry for himself too, which is the problem," Margaret had replied, with the unsentimental honesty that Grace had come to love about her. "A man can grieve too long if no one reminds him that he is still alive." The thing about Walter Hawkins was that he was not easy to know, and he was not particularly trying to be known, but he was honest in a way that Grace found she could not dismiss. He did not perform warmth he did not feel. He did not tell people what they wanted to hear. He did not make promises that existed only to smooth a moment over. After Clarence Webb, who had been made of nothing but charming surfaces and calculated promises, Grace found Walter's particular brand of quiet directness startling and then, gradually, deeply restful. The first real conversation they had happened in April, during a storm that came in from the northwest so fast it turned the afternoon black in 20 minutes. Grace had been in the barn checking on the 2 new calves they had that week, and Walter had come in behind her just as the rain started hitting the roof like thrown gravel, and they had both stood there watching the storm through the open barn door because neither of them was willing to make a run for the house through lightning like that. "Custer's crossing storm," Walter said, the first thing he had said to her that was not either a practical direction or a response to a direct question. "I beg your pardon," Grace said. "My father used to call fast storms like this Custer's crossing storms. Comes in fast, moves hard, does damage, then gone." He did not look at her when he said it. He was watching the lightning walk across the flat horizon to the south. He had opinions about everything: storms, politics, horse breeding, the railroad. A pause. "I miss the opinions." Grace thought about this. "When did he die?" 8 years ago. Heart, they said. I think it was the drought, really. The drought of 70 broke his heart, and his heart took the rest of him with it. He glanced at her then, a brief sideways look as if checking whether she would find this too much information. "I should not have said that." "You can say things to me," Grace said. "I will not repeat them and I will not use them against you." She said it simply, without making it large. He looked at her directly for the first time in 5 months, and what she saw in his face was surprise, as if the concept of speaking to a person without those words eventually becoming a weapon was something he had forgotten was possible. "Thank you, Miss Doyle," he said, and turned back to watching the storm. After that, they talked sometimes. Not often. Not with any of the deliberate, constructed intimacy of people trying to begin something. They talked the way people talk when they are simply in the same place and have something to say and trust the other person enough to say it. About the cattle operation and the spring market. About the kitchen garden and what Grace planned to do with the north bed. About a book Walter was reading, one of the novels that were circulating through the territory in those years, and what Grace thought of it. About the railroad and what it was changing in Kansas, and whether those changes were good. About the particular darkness of the winter sky, and whether it meant another storm or just the coming of night. Margaret watched all of this with the focused satisfaction of a woman who had arranged things exactly as she intended them to be arranged, though she was subtle enough about it that neither Grace nor Walter would have described her behavior as arranging anything. The summer was when everything began to shift in a way that Grace could no longer describe as simple comfort or professional ease. It was July, and the heat was the particular punishing heat of the Kansas plains in summer, the kind that made the air shimmer and the cattle stand motionless in whatever shade they could find. Grace had been bringing water from the well to the kitchen garden in the afternoon, which was not a task that anyone had assigned her, but which needed doing if the garden was going to survive. And Walter had come around the corner of the house and seen her, and without a word taken the second bucket from her, and carried it to the garden himself. They had watered the garden together in silence, and then sat on the porch in the faint possibility of a breeze, and Walter had brought out the pitcher of cold water that Margaret kept in the cellar for exactly this kind of afternoon, and they had sat there drinking cold water and watching the heat shimmer on the dry grass, and Grace had thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was happy. Not happy in spite of where she was or the circumstances that had brought her here. Happy because of this specific porch and this specific cold water and this specific quiet man sitting 2 feet from her watching the heat. The realization frightened her. She had thought she was done with wanting things from men. She had thought Clarence Webb had conclusively demonstrated that her judgment in this area was not to be trusted, that the warm feeling of certainty she got around a person she was coming to love was not evidence of anything reliable about that person. She had thought the lesson had been learned thoroughly enough that she would never need to learn it again. But Walter Hawkins was not Clarence Webb. She knew this in the way she knew it when the calves were healthy or when the cornbread had come out right, not because someone had told her, but because she had the direct evidence of 11 months of daily observation. Walter Hawkins did not dissemble. He did not perform. He did not have a charming face for company and a different face for private. He was the same in every context she had seen him in, with his ranch hands, with his mother, with the merchants in Cimarron when he went for supplies, and with her. He was honest to the point of occasional bluntness. He kept every promise he made, which she could verify because she had watched him make promises and then keep them. He worked harder than anyone on his own ranch, and did not ask anyone else to do anything he was not willing to do himself. He was good to his mother with a steady, undemonstrative devotion that was more convincing than any amount of dramatic declaration. And he was unhappy in the specific way that people are unhappy when they are containing something they have decided they are not allowed to release. Grace was not a fool. She could see that Walter Hawkins looked at her sometimes in a way that was not how a man looks at a household employee. She could feel the particular quality of his attention when she walked into a room. She had caught him twice in the act of watching her from across the yard, with an expression on his face that he closed off completely the moment he realized she had seen him. She had not done anything about it because she did not know how to trust what she was seeing, and because she was afraid, and because Walter Hawkins was so thoroughly committed to doing nothing about it himself that acting on her own observation felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. The nearest thing to a direct confrontation they had come in September, 2 months before Margaret pressed the ring into Grace's hand. They had ridden together to Cimarron for supplies, a trip they occasionally made together simply because the wagon needed a driver and Margaret's knees were making the journey increasingly difficult. They had been coming back in the late afternoon with the wagon loaded and the light going golden and amber across the grass, and they had passed the place where the Cimarron River bent south, the place where the cottonwood trees grew in a thick line and turned yellow in autumn, and Grace had said without thinking, "This is the most beautiful country I have ever seen." Walter had glanced at her. "You thought so when you arrived?" "No," Grace admitted. "When I arrived, I thought it was flat and bare, and I wondered what I had committed myself to." She watched the cottonwoods moving in the evening wind. But somewhere in the middle of winter, when the snow was on the ground and the stars were visible all the way to the edge of the world, I changed my mind. A long silence. "Are you planning to stay?" Walter asked. The question was delivered in a perfectly neutral tone of voice, but it was not a neutral question, and they both knew it. Grace looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with the studied blankness of a man who had asked a question he was not sure he should have asked. "That depends on several things," Grace said carefully. "Such as," she could not answer that. She could not say what it depended on, not without saying his name, and saying his name in that context would require a courage she had not yet assembled. So she said, "Whether I am wanted here," and left it with all its possible meanings intact. Another silence. The wagon wheels turned. The cottonwoods fell behind them. "You are wanted here," Walter said, and his voice was different when he said it, deeper and stripped of the neutral surface. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "By my mother, certainly. The ranch runs better, she is less worried." He stopped, cleared his throat. "You are wanted here." And then he had said nothing else, and Grace had said nothing else, and they had driven the last 3 miles to the ranch in a silence that was different from their usual silence, charged with everything that had not been said. And when they arrived, Walter had unloaded the wagon with unusual focus and efficiency, and gone to the barn for 2 hours, and Grace had gone to the kitchen where Margaret was waiting with supper, and had caught the older woman's knowing look and had said, "Do not." And Margaret had said, "I am not doing anything," in a tone that indicated she was doing quite a lot, but in her own time. And that had been 2 months ago, and nothing had changed, and nothing had moved, and Walter Hawkins was apparently prepared to want her in that doorway forever without ever doing anything about it, which was how Grace came to be standing in the kitchen in October with a dead woman's wedding ring in her closed hand and Margaret Hawkins looking at her with steady, desperate hope. "This was your ring," Grace said. She opened her hand and looked at it again. The turquoise stone caught the light. "Mine and Harold's," Margaret confirmed. "He had it made for me in 1840. We were 22 years old and we had nothing, and he traded a week's worth of labor with a silversmith for the materials and made it himself. Harold was not a man of fine craftsmanship, but he was a man of great effort." Her voice softened. "I wanted to have that kind of meaning again, not to sit in a drawer because Walter is too proud to walk across a room and say what is obvious to every other person who has ever stood between the two of you." Grace closed her fingers around the ring again. She thought about Clarence Webb, about the way he had said the right things at all the right moments and felt nothing behind any of them. She thought about Walter Hawkins saying "you are wanted here" while staring at the road ahead because he could not trust himself to look at her when he said it. "If I accept this ring," Grace said slowly, "I am not accepting an arrangement. I am not accepting a position or a practical convenience." "I know that," Margaret said. "I would need him to know that too." "He will know," Margaret said. "When you put that ring on and he sees it, and I tell him what I have done, I promise you that man will know absolutely everything." Grace thought about the November morning she had arrived, the gray-green eyes and the carried trunk, and the silence that had been uncomfortable at first, and then become the most restful silence she had ever inhabited. She thought about the storm in April and the cold water in July and the cottonwoods in September. She thought about 11 months of slowly and carefully learning to trust her own perception again, and what that perception told her now. She slid the ring onto her left ring finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, which Margaret noticed and nodded at with the satisfaction of a woman whose plans were proceeding exactly as intended. "He is in the north pasture," Margaret said. "He will be back before supper." Walter Hawkins came back from the north pasture at the usual hour, went to the well to wash his hands and face, came in through the back door the way he always did, and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. Grace was at the stove, stirring the pot of beef stew that was their supper, and her left hand was visible, and the ring on it caught the last light coming through the window. He stood in the doorway for a full 5 seconds without moving or speaking. Then he said, "Grace," just her name. But the way he said it, all the careful, neutral surface gone, was enough to make her turn around and face him. His face was open in a way she had not seen it before, all the contained, disciplined stillness broken apart, and what was underneath it was something that looked like terror and recognition and desperate hope all at once. "Your mother," Grace said, and held up her hand so he could see the ring clearly. "My mother," he repeated, and his voice was doing something complicated. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him with the particular air of someone who had arranged everything and was now prepared to be gracious about it. "I asked her," the older woman said simply. "You would not ask yourself." Walter Hawkins turned and looked at his mother. Something passed between them that Grace could not entirely read, the compressed, dense communication of people who have known each other for 30 years and carry each other's full history in their shared silences. Then he turned back to Grace. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, which was all the steps the kitchen required, and he stood close enough that she could see the years and the grief and the stubborn, careful hope that had somehow survived all of it in his gray-green eyes. "My mother had no right," he said. "Your mother had every right," Grace said. "She loves you, I love you. The two things are not in conflict. The words landed. She watched them land, watched the shock and the recognition move through his face. "You love me," he said. "I have loved you since July," Grace said, "when you carried my water buckets without being asked. Possibly since April during the lightning storm. Possibly longer, but July is when I became certain." Walter Hawkins reached out and took her left hand in both of his and looked at the ring that had been his mother's and his father's and was now, apparently, his and Grace's. "I was going to ask you," he said, and his voice was rough. "I was working up to it. I had been working up to it since September." "You were taking a tremendous amount of time," Grace said, and kept her voice steady even though she felt like the floor was tilting gently beneath her feet. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to one she had ever seen from Walter Hawkins, and it transformed his face in a way that made her breath stop. "I did not want to get it wrong," he said. He stopped. His hands tightened slightly on hers. "Grace, you should know that I have not said anything like this to anyone since Ruth Ann died. I am not skilled at it anymore. I am not sure I was ever particularly skilled at it." "I am not asking for skill," Grace said. "I am asking for honesty. You have never had any trouble with that." He looked at her for a long moment. The stew was simmering on the stove. Margaret had, with impeccable tact, disappeared from the doorway. "Then I am honest when I tell you that you have made this house into something it was not before you came," Walter said. "That I have sat at this table every morning for 11 months thinking about how to say that, and I never found the right words, and apparently my mother ran out of patience before I did." He lifted her hand slightly, looking at the ring. "I would have asked you. I want you to know that. But I am also glad she did it, because I do not think I could have stood another winter of sitting across the table from you, and not being able to say what I mean." Grace felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since before she had even arrived in Kansas, something that had been wound tight since St. Louis and Clarence Webb and the thorough, systematic dismantling of her confidence in her own heart. "Say it now," she said quietly. "I love you," Walter Hawkins said. He said it the way he said everything, without embellishment and without performance, direct and certain, and more moving for its plainness than any amount of elaborate declaration could have been. "I want to marry you, not for practical reasons, not for the ranch or the help or because my mother thinks I should, because you are the person I want to be in this house with, the person I want to ride to Cimarron with and argue with about books and watch the storms come in with from the porch." Grace brought both her hands up to his face and he went very still, as if afraid that moving would break something. "Yes," she said, "to all of it, yes." He kissed her then, and it was not the kind of kiss that performed itself for an audience. It was the kind of kiss that comes from 11 months of carefully maintained distance finally being crossed, and it was thorough and warm and very certain. And when it was over, Grace put her forehead against his shoulder and felt his arms come around her, and thought that she had been wrong about Kansas being flat and bare. She had simply not understood yet what it held. Margaret's voice came from somewhere in the direction of the parlor. "The stew will burn if no one stirs it," she said, in the tone of a woman who was smiling with her whole face. They married in December of 1878, in the small church in Cimarron, which the minister had decorated with pine boughs, because there was nothing else blooming in December on the Kansas plains, and pine boughs were honest and smelled like winter. Grace wore a dress that Margaret had helped her make from fabric ordered through the dry goods store, deep green wool that brought out the auburn in her hair and the warmth in her complexion. Walter stood at the front of the church with his hands quiet at his sides, and watched her come up the aisle with an expression that several people in attendance would describe afterward to their spouses as the most naked thing they had ever seen on the face of a man known for keeping everything inside. It was not a complicated expression. It was simply love, clearly and completely visible, and Grace met it with her chin up and her eyes bright, and the ring his mother had given her already on her finger, soon to be joined by the plain gold band he had ordered from a jeweler in Dodge City. The minister spoke the words. Walter said I do with no hesitation and no flourish, the same way he said everything. Grace said I will with such clarity that the woman sitting in the third pew, the wife of a local cattle buyer who barely knew the Hawkins family, felt the need to press her handkerchief to her eyes. Margaret Hawkins cried openly and without apology and said afterward that it was the best thing she had ever orchestrated, which made Walter look at her with exasperated affection and Grace laugh out loud for the first time in the church, which caused Walter to turn and look at her with the expression that Grace was coming to understand was his version of completely helpless happiness. They had a wedding supper at the ranch, attended by Walter's ranch hands, the neighbors from the 3 nearest properties, and the minister and his wife. Margaret had cooked for 2 days, and the table was more abundant than the kitchen had ever managed before. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete Alvarez who had worked for Walter for 3 years and had a talent for the guitar, played in the corner of the main room, and the evening was warm and loud, and nothing like the careful, contained atmosphere that had characterized the house before Grace's arrival. Walter danced with her, which she had not expected. He danced badly and knew it, which he acknowledged by saying close to her ear, "I should warn you that I am not good at this." And Grace had said, "I noticed." "I do not care," and she did not because he was trying, which she had come to understand was how Walter Hawkins showed the things he felt. After the guests left and Margaret had gone to bed with the satisfied exhaustion of a woman whose plans had come to beautiful fruition, Grace and Walter sat on the porch in the December cold, wrapped in blankets, and looked at the stars that the Kansas sky in winter produced in such extraordinary abundance. "Are you afraid?" Walter asked. Grace considered the question. "Of what specifically?" "Of this, of me, of whether it will be what you want it to be." She thought of what she was afraid of and was honest with him the way she had always been honest with him, because he deserved it, and because she had promised him honesty, and promises meant something to her now in a way they had not always meant. "I was afraid for a long time," she said, "of choosing wrong again, of trusting my own judgment. A man I loved before you was not what he appeared to be, and it took me a long time to believe that my ability to read people had not been permanently broken." She felt his arm tighten slightly around her shoulders. "But I am not afraid of you. I have had 11 months to observe you in every condition and context a daily life provides, and you are exactly what you appear to be, which is the most valuable thing I have ever found in a person: a silence. The kind of silence that had started as empty and become comfortable and was now something richer than either of those." "What happened?" Walter asked. "With the man before," Grace told him. "Not the whole story at once, but enough. The way you tell things when you have decided someone is allowed to know them." She told him about Clarence Webb and the broken engagement, and the money she had lent that was never returned, and the 3 other women, and the emptied accounts at his employer's firm. She told him about sitting in her aunt's house in St. Louis, feeling like every judgment she had ever made about the world had been revealed as fiction. Walter listened without interrupting, and without offering the platitudes that people sometimes offer to fill silence they find uncomfortable. When she finished, he said, "He was a coward," simply and with certainty. Not because he did what he did, but because he could not be honest about who he was. A man who cannot be honest about himself forces everyone around him to carry his lies without knowing they are carrying them. It is a particular kind of cruelty. Grace looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it was." "I am not capable of that," Walter said. "I have many failings. I am too quiet. I hold things too long before I say them. I was so afraid of making another choice wrong that I nearly let you leave Kansas without saying anything." He looked at her. "But I cannot hide what I am. I have never known how." "I know," Grace said. "That is why I am here." The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was the winter Grace learned to be truly at home in the life she had chosen. She had been present in the house before, helpful and professional and beginning to be happy, but after December there was nothing provisional about her presence anymore. She was not a household employee. She was Walter Hawkins's wife, and she was Margaret Hawkins's daughter-in-law, and she was mistress of this limestone house on the Kansas plains, and the position fit her as exactly as the turquoise ring had fit her finger. She made changes. Not grand or dramatic changes, but the kind of practical, thoughtful changes that come from someone who now had full investment in a place. She reorganized the kitchen storage in a way that made everything more efficient. She expanded the kitchen garden in early spring with a plan for what it would produce through the summer and into fall, and she kept records of it in a small notebook, which delighted Margaret and made Walter buy her a better quality notebook when he next went to Cimarron. She joined the women's circle that met at the church twice a month, which connected her to the community in ways that mattered for the ranch's relationships in the wider county. And she continued to learn Walter. This was perhaps the most interesting occupation of the winter, because Walter Hawkins, having been given permission to be known, turned out to be considerably more complex and interesting than the quiet, contained exterior had suggested. He read more widely than she had realized, ordering books through the mail from publishers in Chicago and New York, and he had opinions about them that were surprising and sometimes very funny in their directness. He had a specific and deep knowledge of the land around the ranch that he had accumulated over 30 years of daily observation, the way the water moved in spring, and the direction the prevailing winds came from, and where the best grass grew in a dry year, and what the behavior of the cattle predicted about the coming weather. He was not a man who talked about feelings in general terms, but he was a man who showed them with great precision in specific actions, and once Grace understood the language he was working in, she found him extraordinarily communicative. He also, she discovered in the spring, had a secret competence in mechanical things that he had never mentioned. He could fix anything: the pump, the wagon axle, the kitchen stove, the complicated lock on the root cellar door that had not worked properly in 3 years. He did this without announcement and without seeking acknowledgement, simply identified things that were broken and fixed them, and Grace found this so characteristic of him that it made her love him more every time she noticed it. Spring of 1879 brought the cattle market, which meant Walter was away more than usual, making drives to the railroad yards at Dodge City, and Grace found that she missed him with an intensity that she had not expected and would not have admitted to him directly, but which Margaret noticed and commented on with tactless precision. "You are moping," Margaret said one afternoon in April while Grace was in the garden. "I am working," Grace corrected. "You are working while moping, which is admirable but does not change the diagnosis." Margaret settled herself on the garden wall with the ease of someone who had spent her life ignoring the distinction between sitting places and not sitting places. "He will be back by Friday. I know he will be back by Friday. Your face does not appear to know it." Grace sat back on her heels and looked at Margaret. "Is it always like this?" she asked. "The cattle drives." "It was worse before you came," Margaret said simply. "He used to go and come back and the house was the same either way. Now the house notices." Grace thought about this. The house notices. She had not thought of it in those terms, but she understood what Margaret meant. The particular quality of attention in a place where two people are in love is different from the quality of a place where people are merely coexisting. And its absence, when one of them is gone, is a specific kind of emptiness that is both harder and better than the absence of nothing in particular. Walter came home on Thursday, a day earlier than expected, and the sound of the wagon coming up the lane made Grace put down what she was doing in the kitchen and go to the door and stand there, which she recognized as exactly the behavior Margaret had described when she had said she could not watch her son staring at that door anymore. She was standing at the door, waiting. Walter saw her standing there when he pulled the wagon up, and his face did the thing it did when he was moved but was not sure what to do about it, the slight softening around the eyes and the way his jaw changed. He tied off the reins and came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. "The drive went well," he said. "I am glad," Grace said. A pause. "I came back a day early." I noticed. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the same careful focus he brought to fixing things, deliberate and gentle and completely certain. I did not like being away, he said. Neither did I, Grace admitted. He kissed her then, in the doorway, with the evening light behind him, and the smell of trail dust and cattle, and the particular clean smell that she had come to associate specifically with Walter Hawkins. And she thought that she had been given something she had not known she was looking for, and had almost let herself not find it. The summer of 1879 was when Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Walter on a Sunday morning in July, standing in the kitchen with the particular directness that characterized everything she said to him. She had not built up to it or hedged it. She said, "I am going to have a child," and watched his face. The stillness that came over him was different from the stillness he usually wore. It was deeper and more complete, the stillness of a man who has received information that is reorganizing everything inside him at once. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had only seen once before, that night in December on the porch, and he crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and pressed his forehead to hers and did not say anything for a long moment. "Walter," she said gently. "I am here," he said. His voice was rough. "I am just—" He stopped. "I thought I would not have this," he said finally. "After Ruth Ann, I thought I would not have this. I had made peace with it." "Are you happy?" Grace asked because she needed to hear it said. "Happy does not cover it," Walter said. "I do not have a word for what I am." Margaret's response, when told, was to burst into tears at the kitchen table and then immediately begin planning with the focused practicality of a woman who was going to be of maximum useful assistance. She had opinions about the local doctor's competence, about diet, about rest, about what the child would need in its first year. Grace received all of these opinions with patience and affection, and only occasionally redirected them. The pregnancy was, for the most part, uncomplicated. Grace was healthy and practical about it, continuing most of her work through the summer and into the fall with adjustments as they became necessary. And Walter was a particular kind of careful with her that he had clearly not planned or calculated, but that came from somewhere very deep. He lifted things before she could reach for them. He came home from the fields earlier. He sat with her in the evenings instead of doing the paperwork he usually did after supper, which the paperwork noticed because it accumulated, and Grace pointed this out and made him go back to it, which he did, though he moved his desk into the main room so that they were in the same space. One evening in September, when the summer heat was finally beginning to relent, and the windows could be opened in the evenings again, Grace sat sewing in the main room while Walter worked at his desk, and Margaret had gone to bed early, and the only sounds were the pen on paper, and the cicadas through the window, and the distant low sound of cattle settling for the night. And Grace looked up from her sewing, and looked at Walter's back and thought with a specific, full kind of gratitude that she had come to Cimarron, Kansas, with no expectation of anything but distance and wages and hard work, and she had been given so much more than that, and the man she had been given it with was worth every broken thing she had carried out of St. Louis. "Walter," she said. He turned from his desk. "Yes, nothing," she said. "I simply wanted to say your name." He looked at her for a moment with the full, clear expression that she had come to understand as his face when he was completely and entirely happy. "Grace," he said back, and she laughed, soft and warm in the lamplight, and he turned back to his desk, but the line of his shoulders was different, lighter, and that was enough. Their son was born in February of 1880, in the limestone house on a night when the temperature was 15 degrees below zero, and the wind was coming from the north hard enough to shake the window frames. The doctor from Cimarron arrived by some miracle of horsemanship and determination, and delivered a healthy, furious boy who announced his presence to the world with a volume that surprised even the doctor, who had delivered a great many children and was not easily surprised. Walter was not allowed in the room during the birth, which was the custom, and he spent the night in the main room alternately sitting and standing, and occasionally going to the kitchen to make unnecessary things with the focused misapplication of energy that comes from profound helplessness. Margaret moved between Grace and Walter with the efficiency of a woman managing two crises simultaneously, which she was. When the doctor came to tell Walter it was done, and both mother and son were well, Walter Hawkins sat down in his chair and put his face in his hands for a moment that had nothing performance in it whatsoever. Then he stood up, collected himself in the way that was native to him, and went to see his wife and son. Grace was exhausted in the absolute and complete way that a woman is after the specific work of bringing a person into the world. But she was awake, propped against the pillows with the boy in her arms, and when Walter came through the door she looked up at him, and her face in the lamplight was so open and so present that he stopped in the doorway. "Come and see him," she said. He came and looked down at his son, who was red-faced and dark-haired and extremely new to the entire proposition of existing, and he looked at him for a long moment with an expression that Grace did not have words for. "Harold," Walter said. "For my father," he looked at Grace. "If you agree." Grace looked at the boy. "Harold Hawkins," she said, trying it out. "Harold James Hawkins," Walter offered. "James was your father's name." He had asked her about her family in the winter, the careful accumulating questions of a man building knowledge of a person he intends to know for the rest of his life. Grace's eyes filled. She had not expected that, had not been prepared for the specific generosity of it. "Yes," she said, when she could speak. "Harold James Hawkins." Walter sat on the edge of the bed and she rested against his shoulder, and they both looked at the very new Harold James Hawkins, who had not yet decided what he thought of any of this, and outside the wind was 15 degrees below zero, and inside the lamp was warm, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. Margaret came in eventually and looked at the three of them, and then at her own hands, and for once she did not say anything at all. She simply put one hand briefly on Walter's shoulder and one hand briefly over Grace's and went back out again, and Grace heard her in the main room after that. A small sound of quiet, complete happiness from a woman who had pressed a ring into a palm on an October morning and said, "He will not ask himself, so I am asking," and had turned out to be entirely right about everything. The years that followed had the quality of things built carefully and honestly, which is to say they were not without difficulty, because nothing built by human hands on the Kansas plains in the 1880s was without difficulty. But the difficulty was shared, and the sharing of it made it fundamentally different from difficulty that is born alone. The drought year of 1881 was hard. The summer was brutal, and the grass did not come back the way it should have, and the cattle market was uncertain. And there were months when Walter did the accounts at the desk in the main room, with the careful focus of a man making difficult arithmetic come out acceptable, and Grace sat beside him, and did not pretend it was not difficult, but also did not pretend it was unmanageable. Because she had grown up in a family that had known genuine want, and she knew the difference between hardship and disaster. She took on additional work in those months, making things for the women's circle that could be sold, preserving everything the garden produced with the focused intensity of someone for whom every jar represented direct value, doing the household accounts herself, and finding 3 places where they could save meaningfully without sacrificing anything essential. She showed Walter the accounts when she was done, and he looked at them and then at her and said, "You did this yourself," and she said, "The arithmetic is not complicated," and he said, with a conviction that made the drought slightly less present in the room, "You are remarkable." "I am practical," Grace corrected. "Those are not mutually exclusive," Walter said, and put the accounts down and took her hand, and they sat there at the desk in the main room with Harold asleep in his crib down the hall and the wind dry and hot through the window, and it was enough. The drought broke in the fall of 1881, and the winter of 1882 was wet enough to promise a good spring, and the promise held. Harold grew with the enthusiastic speed of children who are well and happy, and by his second year He was a person of considerable opinions, most of them loudly expressed, which made Walter look at him, sometimes with the particular resigned affection of a man recognizing something familiar in someone else's face. Harold had Walter's gray-green eyes and Grace's auburn hair, and a temperament that was entirely his own, direct and energetic and surprisingly tender with the ranch animals, in a way that made Grace think he had come into the world knowing exactly what kind of person he wanted to be. Margaret was magnificent as a grandmother in the way she had been magnificent as everything else, with energy and presence and opinions, but she also knew when to step back, which was the particular skill that made her easy to live with over the long term. She taught Harold to walk while Walter was on a cattle drive, which she reported to Walter on his return with the elaborate casualness of someone who had been waiting to tell him the story and had rehearsed the telling. Walter had taken his son by the hands and watched him walk, unsteady and fiercely determined, across the kitchen floor, and his face was the face Grace had come to love most, the open, undefended face of Walter Hawkins at his fullest and best. In the fall of 1882, when Harold was 2 years old and steady on his feet and expanding his vocabulary in both English and the Spanish he picked up from Pete Alvarez and the other ranch hands, Grace sat at the kitchen table with Margaret one afternoon while Harold napped and said, "I think there will be another one." Margaret set down her tea. Her face was immediately completely delighted. "Spring?" she asked. "I expect so. Late spring." Margaret reached across the table and took Grace's hand, just held it for a moment, not pressing anything into it this time, just holding it. "This house," she said softly, "what this house has become." Grace looked at the kitchen, the good solid kitchen with its cast iron stove and its calico curtains and its well-worn table and the shelves of preserved things and the drying herbs and the small drawing that Harold had made, a shape that was apparently a horse if you were generous in your interpretation, pinned to the wall near the window. "I know," Grace said. Walter, told that evening after supper, reacted with exactly the same stillness he had brought to the first news, and then the same warmth underneath it, and Grace thought she would never stop being moved by the way happiness looked on Walter Hawkins, so clearly real and so clearly hard-won. Their second son was born in June of 1883 and named Thomas, a name with no particular family significance, simply a name that Grace had always found honest and solid, and when she offered it to Walter he had said yes immediately, which was how she knew he felt the same way about it. Thomas was different from Harold from the first hour, quieter and more observant, the kind of baby who seemed to be taking notes, and grew into a child who could sit still longer than any child in the county, and had a talent for drawing that was considerably better than Harold's generous horse. By 1883, the Hawkins ranch had expanded modestly. Walter had bought the adjacent quarter section of land from a neighbor who was moving his family to Colorado, which extended their grazing range significantly and made the cattle operation more stable. He had also hired 2 additional ranch hands, one of them Pete Alvarez's younger brother Miguel, who was 17 and had grown up around cattle and was, Walter said, one of the 3 best natural horsemen he had ever seen. Grace had her garden and her household and her children and her women's circle and her books and her husband, and she was so comprehensively, specifically happy that she occasionally had to think about it directly, to hold it up and look at it, because it still surprised her that this was the life she had arrived at. She wrote to her Aunt Ruth in St. Louis every month, detailed, honest letters about the life on the ranch and the children and the country. Her aunt wrote back with equal detail, and a certain amount of satisfied commentary about the wisdom of distance and wages and hard work as a remedy for heartbreak. She also wrote, in the 3rd year of their correspondence, that she had heard through mutual acquaintance that Clarence Webb had been convicted of fraud and was serving time in the Missouri State Penitentiary, which she mentioned without commentary and which Grace received without any complicated feeling at all. Only a clean, unclouded certainty that her life had arranged itself exactly as it should. She showed Walter the letter. He read the relevant passage and handed it back and said, with his characteristic directness, "Good." And that was the entirety of his commentary on Clarence Webb, which was precisely the right amount. Margaret's health began to decline slightly in the winter of 1883, not dramatically, but in the way of someone who has worked hard for 65 years and whose body is beginning to negotiate with her about the terms. Her knees were genuinely problematic now, and she tired in the afternoons in a way she had not before, and Grace managed the shift with the same practical thoughtfulness she brought to everything, reducing Margaret's physical work without reducing her role in the household in any way that Margaret would have experienced as diminishment. Margaret noticed this management and was grateful for it in a characteristically Margaret way, which was to say she never directly thanked Grace for it, but one morning in January sat her down and said, "You are the best thing that has happened to this family, including my own grandchildren, and I need you to know that I know it." Grace, who had not cried easily in several years, felt her eyes fill. "That is not true," she said. "It is absolutely true," Margaret said. "And I was the one who arranged it, which means I get to be proud of it." She gave Grace the look that had accompanied the ring into her palm 5 years before, direct and certain and completely without guile. "Harold and I made Walter. We made a good man. But you showed him what to do with being a good man, and that is the larger work." They sat together at the kitchen table in the January light, the two of them who had found each other by way of a newspaper advertisement and an October kitchen, and a ring pressed from one hand to another. And Grace thought about the chain of small things that had brought her here, the broken engagement and the $14 and the train to Cimarron, and the silence on the wagon ride home. And she was grateful for every single one of them with a depth she had no language adequate to. In the spring of 1884, a letter came that Grace had not expected. It was from a woman in St. Louis named Vivian Henley, who had been one of Clarence Webb's other simultaneous engagements, though Grace had not known the woman at the time and knew her name only from what had come out in the legal proceedings. The letter was careful and somewhat formal, as letters are when written by someone who is not sure of their reception. Vivian Henley wrote that she had found Grace's name through her Aunt Ruth, and she hoped the letter was not an intrusion, and she wanted to say that she had followed, from a distance, the account of Grace's life as her aunt had shared it with mutual acquaintance, and she wanted to say simply that it was good to know that the whole terrible business with Clarence Webb had led at least one of them to somewhere worth going. Grace read this letter twice, and then set it down and sat for a moment with it. Then she wrote back, a long and warm and honest letter, because Vivian Henley deserved honesty, and they began a correspondence that proved unexpectedly sustaining for both of them. Vivian was a schoolteacher in St. Louis who had also made a life on her own terms after the Webb affair, and she was intelligent and wry and good, and Grace added her to the small but solid roster of people whose letters she waited for. She told Walter about the correspondence, and he listened with the full attention he always gave her and then said, "I am glad you have that." He paused. "I am glad she found you." Another pause, the kind that meant he was going to say something he had thought about. "You have a way of making people glad they reached toward you." Grace looked at him across the supper table with the boys in their chairs and Margaret across from them, and the lamp between them. "You did not reach toward me," she said. "Your mother did it for you." "I was getting to it," Walter said. "In the spring," Margaret said cheerfully. "He was planning to ask you in the spring. He told me that in August. I gave him until October." Walter gave his mother a look of long-suffering affection. "You never told me you had a deadline." "I had a deadline," Margaret confirmed. "I was not going to watch another winter go by with the two of you being excessively polite to each other." Harold, who was 4 and had recently developed the habit of attempting to participate in adult conversations, said, "What is a deadline?" And the moment broke into laughter, the warm, easy laughter of a family that has learned to be a family, and Walter caught Grace's eye across the table, and the look they exchanged contained everything. The ring in the kitchen, and the storm in the barn, and the cold water on the porch, and all the ordinary, extraordinary mornings since. And Grace held it like something precious and specific and exactly hers. Margaret passed in the winter of 1885 in her own bed, with Grace sitting beside her and Walter standing at the foot of the bed and Harold and Thomas asleep down the hall. It was not unexpected, which did not make it simple. She went quietly and in full possession of herself, which was entirely consistent with how she had lived, and her last coherent words, spoken the afternoon before, had been directed at Grace in a tone that brooked no argument. "You take care of him," she had said, meaning Walter. "Not because he cannot manage, but because he should not have to." "I know," Grace had said. "And tell him from me that I was right about the ring," Margaret had added, with a flash of the humor that had been one of her most consistent characteristics. "I was right about everything." Grace had laughed through her tears. "I will tell him." She told him afterward in the kitchen while the house was still, and the boys were with Pete Alvarez in the barn. And Walter had listened with his eyes bright and said, "She was right about everything." And his voice was the voice of a man who had lost both parents now, and was holding himself together with the discipline that was native to him, and the presence of Grace that was the thing making that discipline possible. Grace had held him then, simply and without talking, and he had let her, which was its own kind of extraordinary from Walter Hawkins. They buried Margaret beside Harold Sr. in the small cemetery outside Cimarron, and the minister who had married Walter and Grace spoke about a woman of purpose and intelligence and love, which was accurate and well said. And Grace stood with Walter's hand in hers and thought about an October morning, and a kitchen, and a ring, and a woman who had loved her son enough to do what he would not do himself. The years continued to move in the way of the Kansas plains, with the wide sky and the seasonal rhythms and the small accumulating beauties of a life that has found its right shape. Harold grew into a boy of 7, and then 8, who was his father's shadow around the ranch, learning the cattle and the land with the same focused observation Walter had always brought to it. And Thomas was 6 and then 7, and spent equal time following Harold and spending hours alone with his drawings, which were becoming genuinely accomplished. In 1886, Grace found herself expecting a third time, which surprised her somewhat at 32, though less than it might have surprised her at 24, when she had not understood yet the depth and consistency of what she and Walter had built between them. She told him in the kitchen in March, the same way she had told him the first 2 times, directly and clearly, and his response was the same as the first 2 times in essence if not in detail, the stillness and then the warmth underneath. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am entirely well," she said. He nodded and reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He did not need to say anything else. They had been married 8 years by then, and there was a whole language between them that did not require words, though words were still used and still mattered, because Walter Hawkins had learned over those 8 years that saying things out loud was not weakness, but a different kind of honesty, and Grace had been patient and consistent in teaching this, mostly by example. Their daughter was born in October of 1886, which felt appropriate to Grace in a way she did not try to explain to Walter. Born in October like everything significant, and she had her father's gray-green eyes and her grandmother's decisive chin, and a personality that announced itself in the first weeks as one that would not be managed without considerable negotiation. They named her Margaret. Walter held his daughter and looked at his wife, and his face was completely open in the way it had become over 8 years of being known and loved. And Grace looked back at him, and thought that the woman in the Cimarron cemetery was somehow present in this, that the ring and the kitchen and the "he will not ask himself, so I am asking" had rippled forward to this room, and this lamplight, and this small person with the decisive chin. "She will be trouble," Walter said, looking at his daughter. "She comes by it honestly," Grace said. He looked up. "I was talking about you," he said, straight-faced. Grace threw a pillow at him, which he caught without moving his daughter an inch, which was also characteristic. The house in the years that followed was full in the way that houses with 3 children and a working ranch are full, with the specific beautiful chaos of people who are all completely present in the same space. Harold was a steady, serious boy who had his father's quality of attention and his mother's practicality. Thomas was thoughtful and observant, and had begun doing drawings that Walter framed and hung in the main room with a pride he was characteristically indirect about but which was visible to everyone. Margaret, called Maggie by everyone including herself as soon as she could say the word, was entirely her grandmother's heir, energetic and managing, and convinced that everything was moving too slowly without her direct intervention. Walter watched his children with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, the focused observation of a man cataloging what he loves. He taught Harold to work cattle at 7 and was teaching him to ride well by 8. He sat with Thomas over his drawings, sometimes in the evenings, with the quiet companionable presence that Thomas needed and thrived in. With Maggie he was occasionally outmaneuvered, which surprised and delighted Grace, because Maggie approached her father with the same fearless directness that Margaret Sr. had used, and Walter found himself agreeing to things he had not fully intended to agree to, and then looking at Grace with a slightly bewildered expression that she found entirely endearing. Pete Alvarez married a woman named Doyle in the summer of 1887, and the Hawkins family attended the wedding with the full warmth of people who have a stake in each other's happiness, and Pete and Doyle settled on the land adjacent to the ranch that Walter had bought in 1882, which Pete was now managing as a working arrangement that suited everyone. Miguel Alvarez had developed into the horseman Walter had predicted, and had his own operation on the far side of Cimarron by then. The women's circle that Grace had joined in 1879 had evolved over the years into something considerably more organized and consequential than its original social purpose. By 1888, it had established a small lending library, raised money for the school building, and provided systematic support to families who hit the kind of difficulty that the plains regularly produced. Grace had been quietly central to all of this, not because she sought any position, but because she was the kind of person that things organized themselves around when she was present, and the other women had learned this about her over the years. Walter came to the library dedication in 1888 and stood in the back of the church where the library was being established and watched his wife accept acknowledgement from the county commissioner with the composed, slightly uncomfortable dignity of a person who is not looking for acknowledgement and is not sure what to do with it. And he had the expression he sometimes had when he watched her from across a room, the expression that Harold, now 8 years old, had once accurately identified as the face his father made when he was thinking about his mother. Grace saw Walter in the back of the church when it was over and made her way to him through the gathered neighbors, and he said when she reached him, "I am proud of you," which was not a thing Walter said easily or often, which meant it was worth considerably more when he said it. "It was the whole circle's work," Grace said. "I know," Walter said. "I am proud of you." She took his arm and they walked back out into the November afternoon, and the plains were wide and the sky was the huge Kansas sky of autumn, going purple and amber at the edges, and their children were with Doyle's Alvarez, and Grace's morning had been full, and her afternoon was about to be full of the drive home and supper, and the evening with her family in the warm house, and she was standing beside Walter Hawkins, who was Walter Hawkins. And she thought that she had been afraid of so many things, and she was not afraid of any of them anymore. On the way home in the wagon, with the sky going dark at the edges and the first stars coming out, Walter said, "Do you remember the night I brought you home from the station, November 11 years ago?" "I remember," Grace said. "You sat up very straight," Walter said, "like you had decided not to let this place see how tired you were." Grace looked at him. "I did not think you were paying attention." "I was paying attention," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been paying attention since that morning, since you sat up straight on that wagon seat in November and refused to let the planes intimidate you." "They intimidated me," Grace said. "I simply did not show it." "I know," Walter said. "That was what I was paying attention to." Grace watched his profile in the last light. 11 years of this face. 11 years of learning its particular language and being learned in return, and the depth of what had accumulated in those 11 years was something she could not measure and did not need to. "Walter," she said. "Yes. I am glad your mother asked." A pause. The wagon wheels on the rutted track. The stars coming out across the enormous sky. "So am I," Walter Hawkins said, and his voice had the quality of a man saying something completely true in the simplest possible way, which was how Walter Hawkins said everything that mattered. They came up the lane, and the house was dark from the outside, but they knew the lamp was burning in the kitchen, because Doylers would have brought the children home and lit the lamp and left supper on the stove. And in a few minutes, the house would be full of their children's voices, and the warmth of the stove, and the comfortable noise of an evening that was completely ordinary and completely irreplaceable. Walter pulled the wagon up and tied the horses and came around to help Grace down, which he still did after 11 years. Not because she required assistance, but because it was what he did, the same way he had carried her trunk without being asked on the first November morning, and carried her water buckets in the July heat, and fixed every broken thing on the ranch without announcing that he had fixed it. She put her hands on his shoulders and he lifted her down and held her for a moment there in the yard in the dark, with the horses standing patient beside them, and the light from the kitchen window casting a rectangle of warmth onto the ground. "Thank you," she said, against his shoulder. "For what specifically?" His voice was quiet. "For being exactly what you are," Grace said. "For not being anything other than that." His arms tightened briefly. Then he stepped back and took her hand, and they walked together toward the kitchen door and the lamp and the voices of their children inside. And the door opened before they reached it, because Harold had been watching for them and ran out in his stocking feet, which Grace would normally have remarked upon because the ground was cold. But she did not remark upon it because he ran directly into his father's arms, and Walter caught him and swung him up with the ease of a man who had been lifting this particular weight, since it was very small, and found the fact of its existence the most important fact in his world. Harold wrapped his arms around his father's neck and said something directly into his ear that only Walter could hear, and Walter laughed. The full open laugh that was rare enough to be remarkable when it came, and Grace watched the two of them in the rectangle of lamplight from the kitchen door, and thought of a ring and a kitchen and a woman who had said he will not ask himself, so I am asking. She thought of the turquoise ring on her finger, Harold Hawkins's ring made from a week of traded labor and a silversmith's skill, which she had worn for 11 years through drought and plenty and birth and death, and all the ordinary extraordinary days between. She thought of Margaret's face when she had pressed it into Grace's palm, the steady, desperate love of a woman who could see what was real and was not willing to let pride or fear stand between the people she loved and the life they deserved. She stepped through the kitchen door into the warm and noisy house, and Thomas was at the table with his current drawing, and Maggie was telling Doyle something with enormous urgency about a matter that had apparently occurred during the afternoon and could not wait another moment. And the stove was going, and the supper smelled like something that was going to be very good, and Walter came through behind her with Harold still on his shoulder, and the door closed against the November night. Grace stood in the middle of her kitchen, the kitchen of the limestone house on the Kansas plains that had been a stranger's house 11 years ago, and was now as much a part of her as anything she had ever been, and she looked at her family in the lamplight and felt the fullness of it without any complication or reservation or fear. She reached up and touched the turquoise ring, as she sometimes did. An old habit by now, unconscious and certain. She would tell her children about it when they were older. about the ring and the kitchen and what their grandmother had done, and why she had done it, and the particular kind of love that does not wait for the person it loves to find their own courage but acts on their behalf, not to take away their choice, but to make the choice possible. She would tell them because it was part of their family's story and because it was true, and because she believed, as she had always believed, that honest stories told by people who have lived them are among the most useful things one person can offer another. For now, she moved to the stove and picked up the wooden spoon and stirred the pot, and Walter set Harold down, and Harold immediately went to look at what Thomas was drawing and began to have opinions about it. And Maggie successfully concluded her urgent communication to Doyle's and turned her attention to her parents with the evaluating gaze of a 4-year-old who suspects she may have missed something by being absent. And Walter came to stand beside Grace at the stove, and she felt the warmth of him beside her that was distinct from the heat of the fire. "Good supper," he said, looking into the pot. "Give me 10 minutes," Grace said. "I was not complaining," Walter said, and reached past her to taste the broth from the spoon with the domestic ease of a man who had been completely, entirely at home in this kitchen for 11 years. "Walter." "Yes. I love you," Grace said, simply the way he had always said things that mattered. He was quiet for a moment, the contained, eloquent silence that she had learned to read like a language. Then he said, "I know." And then, because he was Walter Hawkins and honesty was his native tongue, "I love you, Grace. Today and tomorrow and every day I have left to say it." The supper was ready in 10 minutes and they sat down, all 5 of them, in the limestone house on the Kansas plains, under the same November sky that had been over them on the first morning and would be over them on every morning after, and the supper was good and the children were themselves, and the lamp was bright and the wind was outside where it belonged. And that was everything. That was all of it. That was the whole of what had been made from a ring pressed into a palm on an October morning, and a woman who had loved her son enough to say the thing he would not say himself. It was more than enough. It was precisely and exactly right.